Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Ridge died in his office on a day that was never meant to end this way, a day that began like so many others at Forrester Creations with glass walls gleaming in the morning light and power humming quietly beneath polished surfaces, yet by nightfall those same walls would feel like a sealed tomb, bearing witness to a man crushed not by weakness but by the relentless convergence of pressure, betrayal, and legacy. Because Ridge Forrester did not simply run a fashion empire, he embodied it, carried it on his shoulders like a crown welded to his spine, and on this deadly day the weight finally became unbearable as alliances unraveled behind closed doors, whispered deals sharpened into knives, and loyalty proved to be the most fragile fabric of all. The office, immaculate and cold, became the stage for his final moments as the phones rang unanswered, emails stacked like silent accusations on his screen, and the once familiar skyline outside his window blurred into insignificance, because Ridge was no longer looking outward but inward, replaying every decision that had led him here, the compromises made in the name of survival, the trust extended to people who smiled while hollowing him out from within, the family fractures he believed he could stitch together later, unaware that later was running out. Betrayal did not arrive all at once but seeped in gradually, disguised as strategy and necessity, until the walls of Forrester Creations felt less like protection and more like a pressure chamber, amplifying every doubt, every fear of failure, every echo of voices telling him he was losing control. And when the final blow came, it wasn't dramatic or loud, but devastating in its quiet precision, a revelation, a confirmation that those closest to him had already moved on, already rewritten the future without him in it. Ridge stood alone in that office, the empire he built imploding in slow motion around him, contracts collapsing, trust evaporating, the legacy he fought to protect slipping through his fingers as if it were sand. And in that isolation the truth became inescapable. Power does not protect you when everyone wants what you have, pressure does not strengthen you when it never relents, and betrayal cuts deepest when it comes wrapped in familiarity. His final moments were not marked by panic but by a crushing stillness. A man sitting behind a desk that once symbolized command now reduced to a monument of everything he had lost, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened glass as if asking when the cost became too high, when the dream turned into a trap, when success demanded more than a single life could give, and as his heart failed, whether from stress, shock, or the cumulative toll of a war fought on too many fronts, it was not just Ridge Forrester who died but the illusion that one man could hold an empire together through sheer will. When he was found, the silence was louder than any scream, the absence heavier than any body. And the news rippled through Forrester Creations like an aftershock, leaving executives stunned, rivals calculating, family members shattered, and employees wandering hallways that suddenly felt haunted by unanswered questions, because no one saw this coming yet everyone felt, in hindsight, that the warning signs had been everywhere, in the tension-filled boardrooms, the guarded glances, the strategic smiles that never reached the eyes. Headlines would later reduce it to spectacle, a deadly day at Forrester, betrayed to the end, power and pressure claim another titan, but inside those walls the truth was far more intimate and far more tragic, a legacy ending not in applause or triumph but in silence, a man undone not by lack of strength but by carrying too much of the world for too long. And as the lights dimmed in Ridge's office that night, Forrester Creations stood at the edge of collapse, leaderless, exposed, and forever changed, because Ridge's death was not merely an ending but a reckoning, forcing everyone left behind to confront the cost of ambition, the fragility of loyalty, and the haunting question of whether any empire is worth the life it demands to sustain it. The hours after Ridge's death unfolded with a surreal slowness, as if time itself were unsure how to proceed without him, because Forrester Creations had always moved to the rhythm of Ridge's presence, his footsteps in the hallway, his voice cutting through debate, his decisions setting the pace for everyone else. And now that rhythm was gone, replaced by an eerie suspension where nothing quite made sense and everything felt dangerously fragile, beginning with the moment security found him slumped behind his desk, suit immaculate, tie slightly loosened, the kind of detail that would later haunt those who loved him because it suggested he had still been working, still fighting, still refusing to surrender even as his body gave out. The news traveled quietly at first, contained within hushed phone calls and pale faces. But containment was impossible in a building fueled by secrets and ambition, and soon the corridors buzzed with disbelief, fear, and a darker undercurrent of calculation, because grief and opportunity often arrive hand in hand, and everyone knew it, even if no one dared say it out loud. Employees gathered in clusters, whispering versions of the same question: how could this happen? How could Ridge Forrester, the man who seemed indestructible, simply be gone? While executives retreated behind closed doors, their expressions betraying more than sorrow, revealing cracks of panic as they realized the protective shield Ridge had provided was no longer there, that every unresolved conflict, every deferred reckoning, was about to surface all at once. Files sat open on desks like unfinished confessions, deals half negotiated now suspended in uncertainty, because Ridge had been the final authority, the one person capable of imposing order when chaos threatened to spill over, and without him the building itself felt like it was leaning inward, walls pressing closer, secrets demanding to be exposed. Family members arrived in waves, each carrying their own version of Ridge, the father, the brother, the lover, the rival, and none of those versions quite matched the man who had died alone in his office, because no one ever truly sees the whole of someone who lives at the intersection of power and responsibility, grief fractured along familiar fault lines, old resentments resurfacing even as tears fell, because Ridge had been a force that shaped lives as much through absence as through presence. His devotion to the company often leaving emotional debts unpaid, and now those debts demanded settlement, turning mourning into confrontation, sorrow into accusation, love into regret. Behind the scenes, the question no one wanted to ask but everyone feared loomed larger with each passing hour: what really happened in that office? Official explanations spoke of stress, of the unbearable pressures of leadership, of a heart pushed too far for too long, but Forrester Creations was not a place that accepted simple answers, and suspicion spread quietly, threading itself through conversations and glances, because Ridge's final day had been too turbulent, too full of sudden reversals and secret meetings, to dismiss as coincidence. People remembered his closed-door arguments, his tense phone calls, the way he had paced the hallway as if hunted by something unseen, and they wondered, not aloud, but relentlessly, whether betrayal had merely broken his heart metaphorically, or whether it had done something far more literal. As night fell and the building emptied, the silence became oppressive, echoing Ridge's final solitude, and those who remained felt the weight of history pressing down on them, because Forrester Creations was no longer just a fashion house but a crime scene of the soul, a place where ambition had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. Security footage was reviewed and re-reviewed, every frame scrutinized for meaning, every shadow examined as if it might reveal the truth, but all it showed was a man working late, alone, surrounded by the empire he built, unaware that this would be his last stand. In the days that followed, the media descended with relentless hunger, reducing Ridge's life and death to headlines and soundbites, transforming private grief into public spectacle, and inside the company the pressure mounted as shareholders demanded answers, rivals circled like vultures, and the board fractured into competing visions of the future, each claiming to honor Ridge's legacy while quietly reshaping it to suit their own ambitions. Emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Voices rising, alliances shifting, because without Ridge's authority there was no clear center, only a vacuum pulling everyone inward, forcing them to choose sides whether they were ready or not. Those closest to Ridge began to unravel in different ways, some retreating into guilt over the signs they missed, others lashing out in anger at a system that had devoured him, and still others clinging desperately to the idea that his death must mean something more, that it could not simply be the end of a man but had to be a catalyst, a warning, a reckoning. His office remained untouched for days, the door closed like a wound no one dared reopen, until finally someone had to step inside and confront the reality that Ridge Forrester was not coming back, that the chair at the head of the table would remain empty unless someone claimed it, and that claiming it would mean inheriting not only power but the ghosts that came with it. When the office was finally reopened, it felt less like a workspace and more like a shrine, every object infused with significance, the sketches on the wall, the notes scribbled in the margins of contracts, the personal items that hinted at a life lived in constant motion, and those who entered felt an almost physical resistance, as if the room itself rejected the idea of a successor, because Ridge had not just occupied that space, he had defined it, and replacing him felt like erasure rather than continuation. Yet business could not pause forever, and the tension between honoring the past and surviving the future sharpened into something dangerous, something capable of destroying what little stability remained. As investigations continued, uncomfortable truths began to surface, about internal power plays, about decisions made in Ridge's absence, about pressures applied from both inside and outside the company, and while no single revelation provided definitive answers, together they painted a picture of a man under siege, beset on all sides by demands that never ceased, expectations that never softened, and betrayals that cut deeper precisely because they came from people he trusted. The narrative shifted from tragedy to indictment, forcing everyone involved to confront their role in creating an environment where collapse was not just possible but inevitable. Ridge's funeral became a spectacle of its own, a gathering of elegance and sorrow where black suits and designer dresses concealed raw emotion, and eulogies spoke of vision, strength, and legacy while carefully avoiding the darker truths, because acknowledging those truths would require accountability, and accountability was the one thing no one seemed ready to face. Yet even in death, Ridge exerted a strange influence, his absence forcing conversations that had been postponed for years, his silence louder than any speech he had ever given. In the end, the question that haunted everyone was not how Ridge died, but why no one stopped it, why a man surrounded by people could still end up so completely alone, and whether Forrester creations could survive without repeating the same cycle that had consumed him, because Ridge's death was not an anomaly but a mirror, reflecting the cost of unchecked ambition, the danger of equating worth with control, and the tragedy of mistaking endurance for invincibility. And as the company moved forward, fractured, wary, forever altered, it carried with it the knowledge that power always demands a price, that pressure always finds its breaking point, and that betrayal does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when there is nothing left to give. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing sunrise Forrester Creations felt less like a company and more like a living organism struggling to survive the loss of its heart, because Ridge's death had not settled into memory the way people expected. It lingered, unsettled and corrosive, reshaping every interaction, every decision, every silence that stretched too long in a conference room where his voice should have been the final word. The building still opened on time, lights still flicked on, fabric was still cut and sewn, design still pinned to boards, yet there was an unmistakable hollowness to it all, as if everyone were performing the motions of productivity while quietly waiting for something else to collapse, something unseen but inevitable, and that waiting created a tension so thick it followed people home at night, slipping into their dreams, replaying unfinished conversations with a man who would never answer again. At the center of that tension was the boardroom, once a place of structured conflict and controlled debate, now transformed into a battleground where grief was weaponized and loyalty questioned with surgical precision, because Ridge's absence had removed the one force capable of keeping ambition in check, and without him every unresolved rivalry surged to the surface, raw and unfiltered. Arguments erupted over strategy, over leadership, over who truly understood Ridge's vision and who had merely benefited from standing close to him, and each side claimed to act in his name even as their interpretations diverged wildly, revealing just how fractured that legacy truly was, how differently he had been seen by those who worked beside him, loved him, feared him. Some insisted Ridge would have wanted stability above all else, a steady hand guiding the company forward without dramatic shifts, while others argued just as fiercely that his final days proved the system itself was broken, that honoring him meant dismantling the pressures that had crushed him, even if that meant radical change. These debates were not theoretical but deeply personal, because every proposed path forward carried an implicit judgment about Ridge's life and death, whether he was a victim of circumstance or a casualty of his own choices, whether the empire failed him or whether he failed to let go when he should have, and no one could argue without also confronting their own complicity in the environment that had defined him. Outside the boardroom, the creative teams felt the loss in quieter but equally profound ways, because Ridge had not only been an executive but a symbol of creative authority, someone whose approval could validate months of work or dismantle it with a single look, and without that final arbiter designers found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty, second-guessing instincts they once trusted, afraid that any misstep might accelerate the company's downward spiral. Inspiration became harder to access when it was entangled with fear, and the collections began to reflect that anxiety, boldness giving way to caution, innovation dulled by the constant awareness that the stakes were higher than ever and the margin for error thinner than it had been in years. Meanwhile, the investigation into Ridge's death continued quietly in the background, officially routine but emotionally volatile, because each interview reopened wounds, each request for clarification felt like an accusation, and even those who had nothing to hide found themselves replaying Ridge's final interactions with forensic intensity, searching for meaning in tone, in timing, in words that now felt weighted with unintended finality. Some remembered him as distracted, others as unusually focused, still others as exhausted to the point of fragility, and these conflicting recollections only deepened the sense that Ridge had been living multiple realities at once, presenting different versions of himself depending on what the moment required, until the strain of maintaining them all became unsustainable. For those closest to him, the grief evolved into something more complex and more dangerous, because love rarely survives loss in its purest form. It mutates, intertwining with regret, anger, and unanswered questions, and Ridge's inner circle was no exception. Relationships strained under the pressure of shared history now stripped of its anchor, old resentments resurfacing with renewed intensity as people began to question whether Ridge's death absolved past wrongs or magnified them. Conversations that once would have ended with "Ridge will handle it" now spiraled into emotional confrontations, because there was no longer anyone to defer to, no authority powerful enough to impose closure. At night, when the building emptied and the city lights reflected off the glass like distant stars, the office where Ridge died seemed to exert a gravitational pull, drawing people back to it in moments of doubt or crisis, as if proximity to that space might offer clarity or absolution. Some entered out of reverence, others out of curiosity, and a few out of desperation, hoping to find some overlooked clue in the remnants of his final work, a note, a sketch, a half-written thought that might reveal what he had been trying to do in those last hours. But what they found instead was the unsettling realization that Ridge's life, like the company he led, had been a constant negotiation between vision and survival, creativity and control, and that no single artifact could resolve the contradictions he left behind. As weeks passed, the external pressures intensified, because the world does not pause for mourning, and competitors wasted no time exploiting the instability at Forrester Creations, launching aggressive campaigns, poaching talent, and quietly sowing doubt among investors about the company's future viability. Every rumor was amplified, every internal disagreement leaked outward, feeding a narrative of decline that became increasingly difficult to counter, and inside the company the sense of siege grew stronger, reinforcing the very dynamics that had contributed to Ridge's collapse in the first place, as people worked longer hours, guarded information more closely, and measured success not by creativity or collaboration but by survival. This self-perpetuating cycle forced a reckoning that could no longer be postponed, because it became clear that without deliberate intervention, Ridge's death would not be the end of the crisis but merely its opening chapter. And slowly, painfully, conversations began to shift from who should replace him to whether anyone should, from how to preserve his legacy to whether that legacy itself needed redefinition. These discussions were messy and emotionally charged, because letting go of Ridge's model of leadership felt like a betrayal, yet clinging to it felt like repeating the same fatal mistake, and navigating that paradox required a level of honesty and vulnerability that Forrester Creations had not encouraged in years. Some resisted this shift fiercely, arguing that strength meant continuity, that showing doubt would only embolden critics and accelerate collapse, while others insisted that true strength lay in acknowledging failure and learning from it, even if that meant dismantling long-held hierarchies and redistributing power in ways that felt uncomfortable or risky. The tension between these perspectives played out not only in meetings but in everyday interactions, in whose ideas were heard, whose were dismissed, whose authority was respected and whose was quietly undermined, and the company's culture hung in the balance, teetering between evolution and implosion. In private moments, individuals grappled with their own relationship to Ridge's memory, because grief is never just about the person who died but about who we were in relation to them, and for many at Forrester Creations, Ridge had been both inspiration and obstacle, mentor and adversary, protector and pressure point. Reconciling these contradictions became an intensely personal process, one that forced people to confront not only what Ridge meant to them but what they had sacrificed in the process of following him, what parts of themselves they had suppressed to fit into a system that demanded constant excellence at the expense of balance or well-being. As the first major anniversary of Ridge's death approached, the company faced a defining moment, one that would determine whether his passing would remain a source of unresolved trauma or become a catalyst for transformation, and preparations for a commemorative event brought these tensions into sharp relief, because deciding how to honor him meant deciding which version of him to immortalize: the visionary leader, the tireless executive, the flawed man stretched beyond his limits, and every choice carried symbolic weight. Speeches were drafted and redrafted, exhibits curated and reconsidered, because no one wanted to be accused of exploiting his death for image management, yet no one wanted to appear disconnected from the legacy that still defined the brand. On the day itself, the atmosphere was heavy but charged, a mixture of reverence and anticipation, as employees gathered to reflect not only on Ridge's life but on the uncertain future they now shared, and as stories were told and images displayed, a more nuanced portrait of Ridge emerged, one that acknowledged both his brilliance and his vulnerability, his contributions and his costs. And in that acknowledgement there was a subtle but significant shift, a collective recognition that honoring him did not require repeating his path, that legacy could be preserved through evolution rather than imitation. In the aftermath of that moment, something began to change, not dramatically or all at once, but gradually, in the way people spoke to one another, in the willingness to question assumptions, in the slow redistribution of responsibility that reduced the concentration of pressure on any single individual. It was an imperfect process, marked by setbacks and resistance, but it represented a conscious departure from the culture that had isolated Ridge in his final hours, and for the first time since his death, there was a sense that the company might not just survive but learn. Ridge's presence did not disappear in this transformation, it lingered, reframed rather than erased, a reminder of both what was possible and what was dangerous, and in that balance lay the true weight of his legacy, not as a cautionary tale meant to inspire fear, nor as a myth meant to inspire blind devotion, but as a complex human story that demanded reflection and responsibility. And as Forrester Creations moved forward, carrying the scars of loss alongside the promise of renewal, Ridge's final lesson became clear in a way it never had while he was alive, that no empire, no matter how powerful, can afford to forget the humanity of those who build it, and that silence, once mistaken for strength, must never again be allowed to become the place where everything ends.